Hello again and welcome from the deep into another episode of The Graveyard Shift. Today we are going to be reviewing the new Netflix series from Guillermo Del Toro, Cabinet of Curiosities. This is a brand new series. As of this recording, they just came out with their 8th episode yesterday. I was actually going to do this review the day before, but wanted to wait for all the episodes to come out so I could give a very honest review of the whole series. Now, this is not going to be a review going through every single episode, simply because every episode is different, nothing really connects, and since I'm doing this after having binged the whole series, it's a little hard to keep track of story to story to story, especially since I didn't really take notes for this one. Usually Mike and I take notes. I did not take notes for this one, honestly, because I was not expecting to review it, but I'm reviewing this series because I liked it so much. Now, this is not a series that is entirely directed by Guillermo Del Toro. It's rather a series created by him. We do have a couple episodes in here that are directed by him. One of the stories is actually based on a short story that he wrote, and so he does have a lot of involvement as far as that goes, but he's more of a showrunner and a host for this one. As far as the cast goes, we do have a lot of really big names in here. And I'm just gonna have to read them off of Google simply because, like I said, every episode has different actors, and so we've got a lot of different actors in this. But we've got actors like Andrew Lincoln, Rupert Grint, Crispin Glover, Tim Blake Nelson, Charlene Yee, F. Murray Abraham. The list goes on and on and on. There's also a lot of actors in here that I'm not familiar with, and so we do have kind of a nice mixture of very well-known actors with some actors that might not be so well known. Now, in indie circles, a lot of these actors might be well known, as well as the directors too. The directors are the same thing. Every episode has a different director. If I was doing this episode by episode, we could go through them. I only say that because I don't want it to seem like I'm doing a disservice to the cast or the directors or the cinematographers on these episodes. It's just a lot of information to hold, and so I'm not going to go through every single person that was involved in those aspects of the filmmaking. Instead, this review is going to be more about the series overall. Now, as I said, Guillermo Del Toro does act as host for the show, and I say that because this is set up very much like the Twilight Zone, in the sense of every single episode is different, and every episode gets an introduction by Guillermo Del Toro, much like Rod Serling used to do on the Twilight Zone. Now, running along the lines of the Twilight Zone comparison, I am comparing it to the Twilight Zone and not other shows that have had the same kind of model, like Tales from the Crypt, and the reason I'm doing that is because these stories feel more like the Twilight Zone than the new Twilight Zone from Jordan Peele does. Now, personally, I am not a big fan of the new Twilight Zone series simply because it does not feel like the Twilight Zone. Personally, I like that because I feel like having the creator of the series also be the host, again, lends itself to the Twilight Zone, which is one of my all-time favorite anythings, movies, TV. The stories as well feel very Twilight Zone. The way the dialogue happens, the way the characters are. I really like that. I feel like it gives this really uncomfortable, almost unnatural vibe to the characters. The dialogue is the same way. We do get episodes that have rather long monologues that normally wouldn't work, but in the settings that they're put in, they do end up working. We do get these almost like really campy kind of dialogues between characters in a couple different episodes, and that's because every episode seems to happen in a different time period. We've got the 30s in here. We've got the, I think, late 1800s in one episode. We've got more current ones. We've got some that happened in the 70s, so a lot more like modern history type of stuff. And so that's another thing that I really liked, is we get different aesthetics throughout the entire series. With the Twilight Zone, a lot of the times it had some element of the 50s or the 60s in there, and even when it wasn't in that kind of modern time frame, you still got this vibe of it being in the 50s and the 60s. But there isn't a lot to really say about this series that's negative. The cinematography in every episode is awesome. It lends itself to the time period that it's supposed to be in. The aesthetic aesthetic really plays a big part in pulling you into the story. Rather than being artistic for the sake of being artistic, it's artistic for the sake of telling the story. And that's how you do artistic cinematography. I find that in a lot of TV shows, especially a lot of Netflix shows right now, we get these artsy aesthetics through cinematography that are there to more be artistic than lend themselves to the story. And that's another thing that's really great about this series, is it doesn't feel like every single other Netflix series. I feel like every other Netflix series, movie, every Netflix thing seems to have the same exact aesthetic. And so that was really nice to see how everything really changes, not just from the aspect of everything looking similar and formulaic at this point as far as Netflix goes, but also within the show. Every episode looks different. Every episode feels different. And that was something that was really nice and really refreshing, but really not surprising when we're getting something from a person like Guillermo Del Toro, who is notorious for constantly branching out into all sorts of different stuff and constantly flexing his muscles in terms of cinematography, in terms of story genre. It's not surprising that we get this from him, and that's why I was really excited for this series pretty much from the get-go, because I've never watched anything that I didn't like from Guillermo Del Toro. Now, I've not watched all of his movies. However, every time I see Del Toro's name on something, it's always different in a certain way. Even if it's like really dark fantasy, it's still got a different vibe. It's got a different aesthetic. He doesn't just make movies the same way a lot of other popular directors seem to do, like Tim Burton, Quentin Tarantino, Wes Anderson. They all have a formula that works for them, but at a certain point, I feel like, especially these days, it's starting to become a little bit tired. And that's why someone like Guillermo Del Toro is so refreshing, because we always seem to get something different out of him, and Cabinet of Curiosities is no different. The viewing is a great example. The viewing stands out to me, not just in the way that it looks, because it doesn't look like any of the other episodes. You know, like some of the episodes, although they all do look different, there are some similarities, which you're gonna get that. It's to be expected. However, the viewing is the one that really stood out to me the most as far as cinematography goes. It is absolutely stunning. It takes place in 1979. The lens flares are very 1979. The majority of the episode happens in one room, where we get this very like 70s aesthetic from the architecture, which also feels a little bit futuristic at the same time, to the colors being used, to the prop design, to the lighting. Everything in this episode is amazing, and it's by far the most artistic. And I know I said I wasn't going to go into a specific episode, and that's really as far as I'm going to go with that one, but it's just that episode in particular just blew me away with the way that it looks. Now, the only negative thing I'm going to really say about the series is that after the first half, or the first third of the series, it does start to go down as far as quality of stories, in my opinion, but it doesn't stay down. It seems to come back up. There are a couple in there that are really good as well, but I feel like they really jam-packed the best of the series towards the front. None of them get really bad. They just, I would say, get a little bit less interesting. They get a little bit less exciting. The final episode, The Murmuring, does drag on at times. I feel like it was probably the most boring. It is kind of a haunted house type of movie. So I feel like compared to the creativity and the outlandishness of the episodes before it, it felt the most bland. I don't want to say it felt the least inspired, because it's still very good, but I feel like the last episode is probably the weakest. Now, as I said, the final episode did come out yesterday as of the time of this recording. So on the 28th, the final episode came out. So this is still a very new, very fresh series. I do not know if they're going to continue doing this. However, if this is what we're going to get out of Guillermo Del Toro doing his own kind of anthology series, I could watch this forever. As I said, some of the stories are weaker than the others, but none of them are bad by any means. Now, if I did have to say which which episode was my favorite, I wouldn't be able to pick just one because there are a couple of different reasons for it. I would say as far as the story goes, the first one is probably my favorite. It's got elements of his history, antiques. Tim Blake Nelson is phenomenal in it. I personally just love Tim Blake Nelson anyway, but everybody else in that episode is phenomenal. So as far as the story goes, I would have to say that the first one is probably my favorite. It also involves a lot of elements of the occult, and as I've said on previous episodes, supernatural horror is my favorite type of horror. From there, we get into like creature features and stuff like that. I believe the second episode is just a full-on creature feature. As far as cinematography goes, The Viewing, I can't remember if it's episode 6 or which episode it is, but The Viewing is absolutely my favorite one. The cinematography, the lens flares, there's this lighting effect that they do where, like, for example, when somebody's got a cigarette, it's very hazy, but then from the cigarette will almost create like a shadow going across. And I'm gonna have to look into how they did that because I gotta say, I'm not entirely sure how they pull that effect off, but it's absolutely incredible. Now, I don't know if they're gonna be coming out with a season 2, but like I said, bring them on as far as I'm concerned. But that is going to do it for me today, guys. If you liked the episode, go ahead and leave me a thumbs up. If you really liked it, hit the subscribe button and let me know down in the comments what you think of Cabinet of Curiosities. Did you like it? Are you not a fan of these anthology series? Which one was your favorite episode? And let me know why it was your favorite episode, because maybe you noticed some stuff that I might have missed that I didn't notice. But until next time, I will see you guys later.